Okay, in the first part of this tutorial, we created our initial state for our state machine. So now we need to create an additional state. And this is a state where once the player gets to a certain point, we want the turret to turn towards the player and essentially have a target lock or be targeting the player rather than just patrolling or scanning in its default state. So let's go ahead and look at how we do that. So we could either do the state here and do all the coding here, or we could create another flow graph. So let's go ahead and I want to show you how to create a new state, and we're actually just going to work within the state machine to do this. So if I right click here, I have options to create a flow state, create a super state, create any state, right, or duplicate or cut or whatever. So I'm going to create a flow state. Now, an any state means that basically if you have similar transitions to and from different states, you can use an any state to say that, well, I have these 3 states or 4 states, and I want to be able to transition from one of those states to any one of those other states. It's basically a way to save a lot of work and a lot of transitions between those two. So to start with, we have these 2 states now. And let's go ahead and change the name of this flow state. I have it selected. We're going to call this target lock. And to start with, rather than make the transitions and deal with this, I want to be able to get this state functional before I deal with transitions. And so one of the things I can do is I can change which one is going to start. Now, if it's highlighted in green, that means it's the default start condition of our state graph. So if I right click on this and I go to toggle start, what it'll do is it's going to turn this green. Now note that scan state is still green as well. This means that you can have multiple states that are existing on the same state graph. So you could imagine if this was like, say, if this turret was on a tank, right? You could have the tank body driving through the scene and the turret rotating and scanning while the tank drove, right? So the tank driving would be one state and the scanning essentially would be another state, and you want both of those to happen at the same time. So that is a possibility. We don't want that to happen right now, so we just want to make sure the target lock is what's coming up. So we're gonna, oops, so I did not mean to do that. Hold on a second, let me close this off. We're gonna right click and we're gonna say toggle start. So, right, so it'll toggle that off. So now this one's green, so it's what's going to happen, and right now nothing is going to happen. If I hit play, nothing would happen. So let's go ahead and start making our target lock. So what we need to do for our target lock, and we're not going to worry about whether or not the player is close to this turret or not. We just want to make sure the base action works no matter where the player is in the world. And so to do that, we're going to use the update event. And there's a couple ways we can do this. There are, and we've talked about some of these before, there's a unit called look at, that it's transform.lookat, and what that does is it basically takes whatever object you have, it takes the object that's doing the looking, and it takes the object that is being looked at, and it basically immediately snaps the rotation of the object that's the forward vector of the object that's looking snaps so that it's pointing at the object that's being looked at immediately. And that works, that's really great for certain cases. But in our case, we want a little bit more freedom to choose a couple of things. First, it'd be great if we could control the speed that it follows something, right? So if maybe your character can move faster than the cannon, or maybe it's something that, if you have a difficulty setting, you could have it be on the lower setting, the cannons take longer to turn to point at the player. So you have a better chance of not being hit by a bullet. And at a higher level, they snap much quicker, they rotate much quicker and track you more efficiently, right? And so so we're going to go that route. And to do that, we're going to be using a unit called rotate towards. And if we go ahead and right click and click add unit, it's a quaternion. So I'm going to say quaternion. And you'll see there's this look rotation. That's very similar to look at in a sense. And it's actually, you're just pointing it in the right direction. But that's not what we're going to be looking at. And I misspelled quaternion. So one of the joys of my life. So quaternion. And what we want to do is rotate towards. And if I select this and create this, you'll see that I have a from angle, a to angle, and a maximum number of degrees, right? And so, and this is degrees delta, which means a change in degrees. How many degrees should it change per frame in order to get to this location? And so there's a couple things we'll need to create. So we're going to need to create a rotational speed or a rotational rate variable in order to start this process out. So let's go to our graph variable, or sorry, our object variables over here. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll call this, I'm going to call it ROT, capital SPD, right? Rotational speed. But again, less characters to type is faster. I'm going to make it a float. I'm going to set this to 50 as well, right? This is the same as our scan speed, but it might be nice to have just a separate variable for this in case we need to tweak something or in case they don't work quite the same. So I'm going to go ahead and select my graph and then pull rotational speed in here because that's something that we're going to need. We're also going to do the same thing where we're going to multiply it by time delta time. So let's go ahead and say time.de and say, okay, I got my time.to-time.get, and I'm going to go ahead and do a mult. So I can multiply these two things together, just like always. And this is just going to go right now straight into my max degrees delta. Okay, so I've got that. So then now what I'm going to need is I'm going to need to be able to get where my player is and get the and to get my current position, right? So or get my current rotation. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to open this up so it's a little bit bigger. I'm going to move some of these things out of my way. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say transform dot and I think rotation. And we want to say transform rotation get. We want to get our current rotation. And then we also need to be able to access our player. And to do that, we are going to create another object variable. And I'm just going to go ahead and click over here. And we're going to call it player. And we're going to make it the type is going to be a game object. Right? And right now there's nothing there. So let's go ahead and double click to get out of this. And we're just going to say we've got our our player. Now note that even though I made this change for some reason, right, occasionally I found that it resets it. If you don't assign a game object immediately, it resets it to null. So I'm going to go ahead and drag my player over here until it hits this field, right? Because it's a prefab, I could also click on the dot and find it as one of the prefabs. And this is an embed, so I could also just grab it from my scene. So, but I want to make sure I have this variable. It gives me a little bit more freedom. Okay, so I've done that. So let's go ahead and say, well, we definitely want to get something out of that. So I'm going to select my flow graph. I'm going to click and drag this in here. And what I'm actually going to definitely want to get is is a couple other things, right? So I've got my current rotation, right? This is the rotation I'm currently at, and I want to put this into my from. Now, what I need, though, however, is the is the rotation, is figuring out the angle between my player and the current thing. So let's go ahead and do that. So, okay. So in order to figure out the, right, what I need is this angle between these two, and I need it as a quaternion. And so in order to figure that out, what I need to do is a little bit of, as I need to know, first I need to know the position of both objects, right? Because what I can do is, if I know the position of both of those objects, then I can essentially, right, draw a line between those two things. And that it becomes actually a third vector. And the way that you get that is you can, there's a couple of different ways, but one way that works really well is to subtract the two vectors from each other. And then you get this third vector that's that essentially pointing in that direction. And then you can use that direction that's pointing, you can use something called look rotation that's going to take that vector, turn it into a quaternion that's looking in the right way, and then we can feed that in. And so I'm going to go ahead and I've got my player. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to type in transform.position, and I want to get that. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that and leave it with the self, right? So I'm getting the turrets, and then I'm getting the players. And then I want to subtract the player's position from the turret position. So I'm just going to go to subtract, and I definitely want it to be the vector subtraction. So I've subtracted these from one another, and then what I need to do is I need to take this resulting vector and turn it into some rotation that can be used by this quaternion rotate towards. And to do that, I go over here and I click and I type in quaternion and just do look rotation and forward. I don't need to worry about upwards in this case. But so I go look rotation, and then I feed this into the 2 value here, right? Because we're starting with whatever our current rotation is, right? Which is, in this case, let's pretend it's 0. And let's say our character's over there. And then we're saying we're drawing a line between the 2 characters, and we're using that as our second, like, quaternion angle. Ends up being there. It calculates based on that, and then we rotate between those 2 things over a certain amount of time. Okay, and so to fire this all up, let's grab our update function, and we're going to go ahead and just connect this straight into the rotate towards. And let's go ahead and see what happens. Now, if you're confused by this, having the 2 positions and subtracting them and why that works, as long as you keep this unit together, it's something you can use in the future, and you can go and read about vector math if you're really interested in it, or you can say, oh, that's how you do that, it works, that's great, right? This isn't necessarily a programming course, so we just want to be able to have this work as well as possible. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see if it works. Now, in order for this to be tested, I will need to have my player move around my scene. So I'm going to press W to see if I'm getting anything. And it says I'm getting something, but it is not actually making any changes happen. So what have I messed up? All right, so you'll see that the value here is changing, right? But I'm missing one key step. I'm doing this rotate towards, but what I really need to add in here is to set the rotation, right? Something I completely forgot to do. So let's say transform.rotation, and I spelled it wrong like I always do. And there's probably some extra characters in there. There we go, transform rotation set. So now let's go ahead and feed this in here, and let's feed this in here. Ah, there we go. Right, so now if I click back in here, and move my character around. Now, as I move my character, you'll see that this, right, tracks it, but it moves a little bit slow. So it takes it a little bit of time if I'm moving fast enough past it for it to update, right? So, and that's because I have that speed, that rot speed set to 50. If I was to update that to 100 or something, like let's go ahead and just do that right now. And then I can click back in my game window, right? So now at 100, right, it's moving much more quickly, right? It's really tracking my motion more efficiently. And so, right, by using this speed, you have the ability to control how quickly it can turn to face you. All right, so let's go ahead and stop this because this section is working really well. Okay, so let's go ahead and step back out to our turret state graph, right? Which if I'm just going to open this up. I'm going to leave everything alone right now. We're going to be using some of these states here in a minute, or some of these events here in a minute, but let's go ahead and step back to our turret. Okay, so we've got this. Now it's in red right now because when I played it, it had an error. However, I fixed that, so it should clear the next time we play this. So the first thing we want to do is we want scan state, right, to be our default. So let's go ahead and toggle start, and right click on this and say toggle start. So now this should be off. Now if I'm going to hit play real quick just to clear this and make sure I hit the right buttons and everything's good and it's not still going to give me an error when it plays. Okay, so it looks like it's happy. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and stop that. So now we need to transition from one of these states to the other. So how do we do that? The first step is to right click on our scan state and say make transition, and then we just drag this arrow over until the next state that we want to connect to is highlighted, and we click on it, and then we get this little transition here. But what we need is we need some condition to be met in this state in order for this transition to be triggered to come here. So let's double click on our scan state. And so we've got this huge scan section. So now what we need is we need another update function that's basically going to be running concurrently, that's going to be looking for basically testing to see if our player is within range. And so let's go ahead and I'm just going to go ahead and select this update and copy it and paste it and drag it down here. And I'm going to zoom in as much as I possibly can. And so we need to test this, right? We need some range that that we want to use as our range where anything below that number, the character is going to be tracked. So let's go to our object variables, and let's create a new variable just called targeting range. It's a lot of typing, but it's fine. And we're going to make that a float, and let's set that to 20. Right, so from 20 units away, this turret can find our character. And so we're going to go ahead and click and drag to bring that in here so we can get that variable. And we're going to say, okay, we've got our update function. We know our targeting range. So we're going to need some logic to test that. So we're going to add a unit. We're going to say less. And we could say less than or equal. Oops. Lens shift. Let me try that again. There we go. All right, less or equal. So we're going to say this is our, right, we're going to be testing against our targeting range. And what we need is we need the distance from our player, from the turret to our player. And so there's a vector 3 unit that's going to allow us to do that. So first, we're definitely we're going to need to grab our player and bring our player in, which for some reason, there we go. We're going to need to get our player. And from our player, we're going to need our position vector. So transform.position. And we want to get that. And then we can also just, right, once we've created that, we can copy and paste. And it's already set up to be ourself. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out of it. And then the unit we need to connect these two is called distance. So if I click add unit and I just type in dist, right, I'm going to get a whole bunch of options here, but the big one, the one we want is the vector 3 distance AB. Now, if you're doing this in 2D mode, right, you would want the distance in 2D instead of 3D. So, but it's not that big of a change, so I'm just going to connect these two together. And then once I get that distance, then that distance is going to be fed in as the value that's being checked against our targeting range, right? So is it closer or not? And then if it is closer, we need to do something. So let's go ahead and clearly we're going to need a branch. I mean, there's probably another option as well, but branch works fine. And so that's our testing value. And let's go ahead and we'll just put our update function and connect it here, which should illuminate the rest of our graph. And we don't need to do anything if it's false at all, right? We just need to do something if it's true. And what we need to do if it's true is we need to trigger an event. And the event we need to trigger is actually what's called a custom event. Now, up until this point, we've only used events that Unity has defined, like update, on trigger, on collision enter, etc. So we're going to create our own custom event. It's really super simple. You just right click, you say add unit, and just type in custom. When you type in custom, there's two options. There's custom event and there's trigger custom event. So I'm going to go ahead and do trigger custom event because that's what we want to do. We want to send a true value into here, and then right, that's going to create the trigger, and then we need to name this event that we want to trigger. And so we're going to call this target lock. Okay, so this is our section of the graph that's going to be testing to see if our player is close enough to target. Okay, so now let's go to our transition and do the rest of it so that we can actually transition from one state to the next. So we're going to go back to our turret. We're going to come in and we're going to double click on our transition. And you'll see that there's just one option here, which is state trigger transition. And what we need to do is we just need to right click and say add unit, type in custom, and this time rather than trigger custom event, we just need the custom event. And we need to make sure the name matches exactly. So target, and I did capital L-O-C-K, there we go. And I just feed this right into here. Now, there's other things that could happen during this transition, but this is like the simplest way to make this work. So, right, so basically a custom event happens and it triggers a transition. And you'll notice that now that little custom event icon is showing up inside our transition to let us know how we're dealing with that transition. Now, right now we're doing a custom event, but you can imagine that if you're not using the animator to do different animated sequences based on your movement or what your character is doing, you could imagine keyboard input being the event that's triggering the transition between different animated states, right? There's lots of different things that could happen. Or, if you hit, I don't know, some key to do, your character's doing its normal activities, it's running, but then it's, maybe you can cast a spell and it's some crazy area effect thing and lots of stuff happens afterwards, and that's like a special state, so you hit the letter E and all this stuff happens, right? So that's the event that would trigger it. But in our case, it's a custom event that we're using. So now what we need to do is we need a way to get back from our target lock to our scan state. But let's go ahead and test this and make sure it works first. So I'm going to double click to step out of that. I am going to hit play, and right, I am currently looking at the turret, but let's go ahead and see if the turret, okay, so the turret appears to be scanning, right? It's not looking at me. So let's go ahead and move a little bit closer, and you saw that little pulse happen on the thing, and now this thing is targeting my player. And no matter where I move, it's going to target it because it never gets back out of the target lock state once it goes into it. So let's go ahead and stop this. And let's make it so it can go back. So I'm going to right click on target lock. I'm going to say make transition, and I'm just going to connect back to the start state, right? I get another transition here. And now what I need to do is in my target lock state, I need to set a condition similar to the scan state that's going to allow me to transition back. Now, the fastest way to do that is probably to go double click on scan state and select all this stuff that we just did, copy it, go back to my state graph, double click on target lock, and I'm going to double click again so you can see the whole graph, and then I'm going to move this out of the center and paste this section so it's not overlapping too much. And so now the question is, right, I need to make a change here, right? And basically I just need to say, is it greater than the targeting range? And if so, then we need to do a couple things, right? Because all of the rest of this is the same, but let's replace this unit with greater, and we'll just say greater than. Nothing, it should just fit in perfectly, fantastic. And then the custom event we want to trigger is not target lock, but let's make it target lost. So LOST. Okay, so I've done that. So now I can go ahead and go back to my main thing, double click on this transition that's going the other direction, and right click and add unit and say custom event. And then this one is target lost. And then we can just feed this in here. And let's go back to our main state graph, double click to step out of this, and let's go ahead and see if this works. Okay, so here we go. Let's go in and get a little bit closer. All right, so it's locked on my player, and then I'm going to go ahead and get farther away, and it starts scanning again. Now, it looks like my scan code is a little bit problematic. There we go. It should be bouncing back and forth now. And that's because, right, where I was actually somewhere over here, which is probably like 330 degrees, right? And so it, rather than going the shortest distance back to its 0 point, it went the longest distance back to its 0 point. And that's something that, again, to keep this simple, oh, and it looks like it makes mistakes occasionally still. I might need to go back in and fix that. But, right, so there's still a couple bugs in there. I'm not going to work out all the bugs in this tutorial, mainly because it's, I'm trying to keep it somewhat short. Right, so now I'm locked again, and right now it's freely rotating. And again, there's some issue where I keep, where this isn't 0 any longer. And so maybe what I need, maybe there's some other setting I can do to fix that without a whole bunch of other steps. But okay, so let's go ahead and stop this and go ahead and save our work. And let's go ahead and clean these things up a little bit and make our make some groups around these objects. So specifically on our target lock state, I want to create a group here. And actually, before I do that, I'm just going to shrink everything up a little bit, because for some reason you can't, at least I haven't found a way to resize a group once you've made it, which annoys me. But so I've made that a little bit smaller. I'm going to make a group around it by holding down Command or Control. And I'm going to name this group Target Lost. And again, this is just to make our lives easier when we come back in here after forgetting what we were doing, after, we've totally forgotten what we were doing previously. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and move this over a little bit. Now, this is, pretty well put together. I might want to arrange things a little bit better, but I don't really care that much. So I'm going to go ahead and just hold down Command, click and drag, and we'll call this one track player or something like that, whatever makes sense for you or to you. And I'll make this red. Okay. All right. So I've got those two. I'm going to save this. I go back to my turret. I'm going to go to scan state, and I already have that other group. So with this group, I'm just going to tighten everything up a little bit so that everything's a little bit closer together and it takes up a little bit less space. So ideally, I don't have to scroll all over the world to find everything. And I'm going to go ahead and make a group. I am going to call this group target lock, surprisingly enough. And recolor it to something pretty. Okay. All right, so I've got this set. Now, we're still having some issues with the 0 setting, and so I might go back and check one of my previous examples to see what I did differently. It may be that I'm resetting a value to 0 somewhere, or that I'm using a different unit somewhere than I actually meant to. But the other thing we need to do is we need some way to smoothly transition between these states. So if I come in here, you'll note that there are, it was actually doing a pretty smooth job transitioning to and from, but let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit. Okay, so it's there. But what I want to do is I want to move everywhere, and then I want to test that transition. So it worked pretty well there, but if I come in and come back out, still worked pretty well. I mean, other than the fact that it sometimes, oh, I may be going the wrong direction. I think I just fell off the edge of the world. I did. So let's go ahead and restart this, and maybe I'll zoom out a bit so I can actually see where I am, and go ahead and run this again. Okay, so I come in, it pulls to this way. If I keep going a little bit, it snaps away. Oops. Come back in. Let's go ahead and have this thing chase me over to here and then snap. And you'll see that it rotates around. It should stop at 0 and bounce back and forth. Occasionally it's still not doing that. I'm not quite sure why, but whatever the case, it seems like we're getting actually really smooth transitions between these states. Now, sometimes what happens, and what's happened previously when I did this, is that it will actually snap back to a position that it would snap immediately back, and then that's when you need to change the on-enter state and on-exit state. But we're not going to do that right yet. So let's go ahead and save this. And in the next tutorial, or actually I probably won't even continue the tutorial, I'm just going to go ahead and see if I can fix those things real quick.